The corridors of Kelvarn's eastern wing were never truly silent after midnight, but Sable had learned their rhythms well enough to move through them like smoke. The tap of distant boots, the creak of settling stone, the low murmur of the night guard exchanging posts at the far stairwell. She knew every sound that belonged, which is why the laughter stopped her cold. It came from behind the door to Fenrick's private study, a door that should have been locked. A room where, only hours ago, he had pressed his mouth to the place where her neck met her shoulder and whispered the words she had carried like a lantern through every dark passage of her life in this castle. When the northern treaties are settled, I will present you to the court. You will stand beside me, Sable, not behind me, beside me, as my bonded queen. She had believed him, had let those words sink into her marrow until they became part of her skeleton, part of the architecture that held her upright. And now his voice drifted through the gap beneath that same door, and he was laughing. But it was the second voice that made Sable's blood crystallize in her veins. Valessa. Lady Valessa of House Greyvane, whose perfume lingered in council chambers like a territorial claim, whose fingers found reasons to graze Fenrick's arm at every formal gathering, whose smile, whenever it landed on Sable, carried the precise temperature of a blade left out in winter. Sable pressed her back against the corridor wall. Her hand drifted to her lower belly, where a secret no larger than a whispered prayer had taken root 3 weeks ago. A secret she had planned to tell him tomorrow, on the anniversary of the night he had given her the claiming mark that pulsed beneath her collarbone like a second heartbeat. She should have kept walking, should have returned to her chamber and waited for him to come to her as he always did, smelling of cedar and ink, his eyes soft with the tenderness he showed no one else. But her feet carried her closer to the door, and the words that reached her through the ancient oak would carve themselves into her memory with the permanence of a scar. She pressed her ear to the wood and listened. She genuinely believes it, you know. Valessa's voice curled through the gap like poison silk. Every word. You should see her face when you leave her chamber. Like a child who has been promised the moon and thinks the sky will actually bend. Sable waited for the correction. For the sharp edge of Fenrick's authority cutting Valessa down. For the growl that rose in his throat whenever anyone spoke against those under his protection. What she heard instead was a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. He laughed. Not the warm, rumbling laugh she knew from their private hours. This was something colder. Performative. The laugh of someone sharing a joke he found genuinely amusing. Sable is useful, Fenrick said. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Useful. Her healing gift is extraordinary, and her loyalty is absolute precisely because she believes I intend to elevate her. If I disabuse her of that notion, I lose the most talented healer in 3 territories. So you will simply keep her? Valessa asked, like a pet with a purpose. I will keep her comfortable and convinced. There is a difference. And when we are bonded? When I stand beside you at the Ascension, what happens to your little healer then? A pause. Sable could hear the clink of crystal. Wine being poured. Wine being sipped. The casual choreography of 2 people who had shared this room, this conversation, many times before. She will be relocated to the eastern villages, a generous position, her own clinic. Far enough from the capital that she will not complicate matters, close enough that I can summon her skills when needed. You have thought this through. I have thought about nothing else since the council confirmed our arrangement 3 months ago. 3 months. The number detonated behind Sable's ribs. 3 months ago, Fenrick had taken her to the moonlit grove beyond the castle walls, had bitten the hollow of her collarbone with trembling reverence, and had sworn to her that the mark he left was sacred. Irreversible. A promise written in blood and bone that could never be broken. 3 months ago, he had already known. Every kiss since then, every whispered vow, Every night he had held her against his chest and traced the mark with his fingertips, murmuring that she was his and he was hers, and nothing in this world could change that. All of it performed with the knowledge that she was temporary. Sable's hand pressed harder against her belly. The life growing inside her, conceived in what she had believed was love, suddenly felt like evidence of the most elaborate cruelty she had ever known. Her claiming mark blazed with sudden vicious heat beneath her collarbone. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, swallowing the gasp before it could escape and betray her presence. Then she peeled herself from the wall, turned away from the door, and walked back down the corridor on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. She did not run. She did not cry. She did nothing. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Sable's chamber was small enough that packing took less than 10 minutes. She moved with mechanical precision, her hand selecting only what mattered while her mind floated somewhere above her body, watching a woman she no longer recognized perform the rituals of departure, her grandmother's bone comb, the leather satchel of dried herbs and tinctures, 2 changes of clothing, both plain enough to belong to anyone, the journal where she had pressed a wildflower from the grove where he had marked her. She stared at it for 3 heartbeats, then left it on the bed. Some things deserved to be abandoned in the places where they had been made into lies. She paused at the narrow window. Below, the castle grounds stretched toward the western forest, silver-washed under a moon that was 2 days from full. Somewhere in the wing above her, Fenric was still with Valessa, still laughing, still planning the life he would build on the wreckage of everything he had promised. Sable touched her collarbone. The mark throbbed with dull, persistent heat, as though his teeth were still pressed against her skin. Among wolf kind, a claiming mark was supposed to be a tether, a living thread connecting 2 souls across any distance. If she left, he would feel the pull. He would know something was wrong, unless he had never truly meant the mark at all. Unless a bond built on deception carried no weight in the world of wolves, she supposed she was about to find out. The servants' passage behind the kitchens led to a gate that opened onto the forest road. Sable had used it 100 times to gather herbs at dawn. The night guard knew her face and her habits. He nodded as she passed, thinking nothing of the healer woman and her leather satchel. He did not notice the finality in her step, did not see the way she paused at the tree line, one hand on the rough bark of an old oak, and looked back at the castle for the last time. I hope she was worth it, Sable whispered to the darkness. Then she turned north and disappeared into the forest, carrying his heir and his betrayal in equal measure. By the time dawn broke over Kelverin, she was already gone. 4 months had passed since the night Sable walked out of Kelverin, and the village of Durnhollow had nearly forgotten it had ever existed without her. She had arrived in the bitter cold of late autumn, a young widow, she claimed, carrying grief and a child in equal measure. The village elder, a woman named Osara with hands like knotted rope and eyes that missed nothing, had studied Sable's face for a long time before offering her the abandoned stone cottage at the northern edge of the pines. "We have not had a proper healer since my mother died," Osara had said. "You mend our sick. We do not ask questions you do not wish to answer." Now the first fragile shoots of spring were pushing through the frost, and Sable had woven herself into Durnhollow's rhythms so completely that her old life felt like a story that had happened to someone else. She delivered babies. She drew infection from wounds with poultices of yarrow and golden thread. She brewed teas for fevers and set bones with steady hands. And every night, after the last patient had gone and the candles had burned low, she sat alone in the dark with her palms pressed to the growing curve of her belly, feeling the child move beneath her skin. "You are strong," she whispered in the darkness. "Stronger than your mother, stronger than the lies that brought you here." She never spoke the father's name aloud, could not bring herself to form the syllables that had once tasted like honey and now sat on her tongue like ash. But the child seemed to know anyway. Whenever she thought of him, the kicks grew fiercer. more insistent, as if the small life inside her was demanding she acknowledge the connection she was trying so hard to sever. The movements had grown stranger in recent weeks, dueling rhythms, as if two small hearts were beating a counterpoint against her own. The midwife in the next village had measured her belly, raised an eyebrow, and said she might want to prepare 2 sets of swaddling cloth. But it was the mark that troubled her most. The claiming scar beneath her collarbone should have faded within weeks. A bond rejected, a connection severed. The mark was supposed to dissolve like frost on warm glass, leaving nothing behind but smooth skin and the memory of a mistake. Instead, it had darkened. The edges had sharpened, the lines growing more defined with each passing month, as if the bond was not dying but deepening. At night, the mark burned with a low, persistent heat that crept through her chest and settled behind her ribs like an ember refusing to go cold. And sometimes, in the thin hours before dawn, she felt something she could not explain. A pressure, a searching, a restless hunger prowling at the boundary of her awareness, like a wolf circling a campfire it could not reach. She told herself it was nothing, told herself that what was broken could not reach for what it had discarded. She was not entirely sure she believed it. Mistress Rowan? The voice belonged to Haddon, the tanner's boy, using the false name Sable had given when she arrived. She wiped the herb paste from her fingers and opened the door to find him breathless, his freckled face flushed with the particular excitement that only belonged to children delivering important news. Traders from the south, Haddon managed between gulps of air. They have come through the Grey Cross Pass. They say the Alpha King has lost his mind. The ground shifted beneath Sable's feet. She gripped the doorframe and kept her voice level. That sounds like the kind of story traders invent to sell more ale. But it is true. Haddon's eyes were enormous. They say he has torn apart every village between Kelvarin and the Ashward border searching for a woman. No one knows who she is. They say he has not slept in months. They say his wolf has taken over so completely that his own generals cannot hold a war council because the king shifts mid-sentence and runs into the forest. Sable's mark flared beneath her collarbone. She pressed her hand against it, feeling the heat pulse in time with her heartbeat. They say the crops in the eastern provinces have turned black in the soil. Haddon continued, the words tumbling out like stones from an overturned cart. The pack bonds are fraying. Wolves who have not shifted in years are losing control. The traders say it is because the king's bond is broken, and the whole kingdom is rotting from the inside out. Haddon! Sable's voice came out sharper than she intended. The boy flinched. She softened. Thank you for telling me. Now go help your father before he wonders where you have gone. After the door closed, Sable sank into the chair beside her hearth with her hands shaking in her lap. He was searching for her. Why would Fenric tear his kingdom apart for someone he had never intended to keep? Unless something had changed? Unless something had been wrong that night in ways she had not considered. The ember behind her ribs pulsed, and for the first time in months, Sable did not push it away. 3 days after the trader's visit, the wolves appeared. Sable saw them at dusk, standing where the pine forest met the meadow like sentinels carved from shadow. 4 shapes, their coats ranging from deep iron to pale ash, their eyes catching the last light with an intelligence that no ordinary animal possessed. They did not approach. They did not retreat. They simply watched her cottage with the patient, focused attention of soldiers awaiting orders. The mark beneath Sable's collarbone ignited. This was a searing, clawing heat that drove her to her knees on the cottage floor. One hand braced against the rough planks, the other pressed to her chest as if she could hold the fire in. She felt him, his presence, fractured and wild, pressing against her consciousness like a fist against glass. He was close. A knock at the door. Measured, deliberate. The knock of someone trained to deliver difficult news with composure. Sable grabbed the iron fire poker and rose on unsteady legs. When she opened the door, two men stood on her threshold. Both wore the deep charcoal cloaks of the king's inner guard, but it was the man on the left who held her attention. He was perhaps 50, his jaw shadowed with silver stubble, his posture carrying the particular stillness of a wolf who had learned to keep his animal leashed through decades of discipline. "My lady," he said, and the tremor in his voice was unmistakable. "My name is Corin. I serve as first shield to the Alpha King. We have been looking for you for a very long time." "You have the wrong woman." Sable kept her voice flat. "My name is Rowan. I am a healer." Coran's gaze dropped to where her hand pressed against her collarbone. "You are Sable, born of the Commons, formerly in service to the royal house of Kelverin. You carry the king's claiming mark and his child. And I have crossed 6 provinces and 2 mountain ranges to find you before someone else does." The poker wavered in her grip. "Before someone else does? May I come inside? What I have to tell you is not safe for open air." Sable wanted to refuse. But the mark was burning, the baby was kicking against her ribs, and the look on this man's face was not the look of a hunter cornering quarry. It was the look of someone delivering a warning. She stepped aside. Corin entered alone. He surveyed her cottage, the bundles of drying herbs, the simple furniture, the narrow bed with its threadbare quilt, and his jaw tightened with something that looked like anger directed at someone who was not in the room. "The night you left Kelvarin," he began, "the conversation you overheard between the king and Lady Valessa, it was not what you believe it was." Sable's grip on the poker turned savage. "I heard him with perfect clarity. He called me useful. He described his plan to discard me. There was no ambiguity. There was sorcery." The word dropped into the silence like a coal into snow. House Greyvane has employed a shadow speaker for years, a practitioner of vocal enchantment. It is a rare and illegal gift that allows the caster to construct false conversations using the voices of real people. The words you heard through that door were fabricated, planted specifically for you to overhear. Sable sat down hard on the edge of her bed. "That is impossible. I heard his laugh, his exact laugh." A shadow speaker does not imitate. They harvest. They collect fragments of a person's voice over weeks and months, then weave them into new sentences indistinguishable from the original. Valessa had access to the king for years. She had more than enough material. Why? The question tore from Sable's throat. Why go to such lengths? Because the king intended to announce you as his bonded mate at the Ascension ceremony. The Greyvanes learned of this through a spy in the king's household. They knew that once the bond was publicly declared, their daughter's claim would be destroyed. So they manufactured a conversation designed to drive you away in silence, without confrontation, without giving the king a chance to explain. Sable pressed both hands to her face. The memory replayed behind her closed eyes. The laughter, the clink of crystal, the casual cruelty. She had examined that conversation 1,000 times during her exile, searching for cracks, for inconsistencies, for any sign that what she heard was not real. She had found none, because the magic had been flawless. "What happened after I left?" she heard herself ask. "The king went to your chamber at dawn, as he did every morning. He found it empty. No letter, no explanation." Corin's expression darkened. He tore the room apart with his bare hands before his wolf took over completely. He shifted and ran. For 3 days, we could not find him. When we did, he was 70 miles north, half wild, following a scent trail that your head start had made nearly impossible to track. It took 6 of us to bring him back to human form. Coran's voice lowered. "He has not been fully human since. The bond between you did not break when you left. It stretched, and it has been pulling him apart. His wolf believes its mate has been stolen. It does not understand departure. It only understands that she is gone." Sable's mark pulsed with agonizing heat, and she felt something that broke through her carefully constructed armor. Grief. Bottomless, howling grief. Not the grief of someone who had lost a convenience. The grief of a wolf who had lost its soul. "There is more," Corin said, and the shift in his tone made Sable's stomach clench. He withdrew a folded parchment from inside his cloak. The seal was broken, but the impression in the dark wax was unmistakable. A silver serpent coiled around a dagger. House Gravane. "We intercepted this 4 days ago." Sable took the parchment with numb fingers and read the 3 lines written in elegant, unhurried script. "The healer has been located north of the Grey Cross. Dispatch the quiet knives before the next moon. The king must have nothing to find." "Assassins," Sable breathed. "The Greyvane's private killers. We do not know how many have been sent or how close they are." Corin knelt before her. "Fenric will find you with or without my help. The bond is leading him to you like a compass needle finding north, but the quiet knives may arrive first." A howl split the evening air from the direction of the forest. Low, sustained. A warning call that made every hair on Sable's arms stand rigid. Corin was on his feet instantly. "That is not one of ours." New shapes moved between the pines. Darker, leaner. They slipped between trees with the fluid coordination of predators who had hunted together many times before. And behind them, barely visible against the darkening sky, a figure on horseback, hooded, still, watching. The quiet knives had arrived. The first arrow came through the kitchen window before Sable could draw breath to speak. It buried itself in the wall behind her head, with a sound like a cleaver hitting a block. Corin moved before the glass had finished falling, his body driving her toward the floor as a second arrow split the air where her chest had been a heartbeat earlier. She hit the ground hard, her arms wrapping around her belly, and she registered the dark, glistening liquid on the arrowhead still quivering in the wall. "Poison. They are not here to capture you," Corin said, his voice stripped of everything except tactical calm. "They are here to end this quickly." The guard at the door had already shifted, his human form erupting into a broad-shouldered wolf that launched itself through the doorway toward the tree line. A chorus of snarls erupted from the darkness, then a yelp, then silence. Corin pressed a blade into Sable's hands. The handle was wrapped in leather, the edge gleaming with a faint silver sheen. "Moon-forged steel, it will cut anything that bleeds, shifted or not. Stay behind the hearth. Do not come out until you hear my voice or the king's." "Corin, there are too many." "There are always too many. That is why I have done this for 30 years. He smiled, brief and fierce, and then his body reformed into a slate-gray wolf that crashed through the side window to meet the attackers. Sable crouched behind the stone hearth, the moon-forged blade clutched in her fist. Through the ruined windows she could see the battle in jagged glimpses, Coran's wolf grappling with 2 darker shapes. The flash of teeth. Dark stains on white snow. A third dark wolf circled wide and came through the back door. It was inside the cottage before Sable could scream. Its eyes, flat and professional, and utterly without mercy, fixed on her belly. It lunged. Sable swung the blade. The moon-forged edge caught the wolf across the muzzle, and the animal shrieked, stumbling sideways. But it recovered fast, resetting its stance, preparing to charge again. And then something detonated inside Sable's chest. Not pain, not fear. Something older. Something that had been coiled beneath her healing gift since the day she was born, dormant and patient, waiting for the precise moment when the woman who carried it had no other choice. Light erupted from her hands. Not candlelight, not torch glow. A luminous, sun-bright radiance that poured from her palms like liquid dawn, flooding the cottage with warmth so intense that the frost on the remaining windows evaporated instantly. The dark wolf recoiled, its fur smoking where the light touched it, and a sound tore from its throat that was less growl than whimper. It scrambled backward and fled into the pines. Sable stared at her own hands. The light pulsed in time with her heartbeat, steady and warm and primordial. She had spent her life believing her gift was small, useful for mending cuts and easing fevers. A servant's talent. This was not small. Through the window she saw Corin pinned against a fallen pine, 3 wolves circling him with bared teeth. His gray fur was torn and darkened with wounds. One hind leg dragged at an angle that meant something was broken. Sable did not make a conscious decision. Her body simply moved. She stepped through the doorway into the freezing night, bare feet pressing into the snow, her hands blazing with radiant fire, and she walked toward the wolves who were killing the wolf who had come to save her. "Get away from him!" Her voice carried something beneath the words, a resonance that vibrated in the bones, in the marrow, in the deep animal architecture of every wolf in the clearing. The 3 attackers froze, their heads turned, their pupils contracted to pinpoints against the blinding light. Sable knelt beside Corin and pressed her burning palms to his shattered leg. She felt the fracture knitting beneath her touch, felt the damaged tissue reaching for wholeness, felt the healing pour out of her with a force that left her dizzy and gasping. Corin's wolf went still as the pain released its grip. The 3 dark wolves broke and ran, vanishing into the forest like smoke pulled by wind. But the hooded rider had not moved. Sable looked up to see the figure at the far edge of the clearing. A crossbow rested across the saddle, its bolt aimed with unhurried precision at Sable's chest. "Impressive," a woman's voice called from beneath the hood. "House Greyvein will be fascinated to learn that the king's little healer is something considerably more than advertised." Sable's power flickered. The healing she had poured into Coran had hollowed her out, and the light in her palms was dimming like a lantern running low on oil. The rider's finger tightened on the trigger. And then the earth shook. A concussive, ground-splitting impact that repeated in rapid succession, growing louder with each strike, as if something enormous was running toward them with enough force to crack the frozen ground beneath its feet. Trees snapped like kindling. A pine that had stood for 200 years toppled sideways with a groan. The hooded rider's horse screamed and reared, and for the first time, the woman's composure fractured. A wolf the size of a draft horse exploded from the tree line. Its fur was black as a moonless sky, its eyes twin furnaces of molten gold. It crossed the clearing in 2 strides, and its jaws closed around the crossbow, snapping the weapon apart in a burst of splintering wood and twisted steel. The rider was thrown. She hit the ground, rolled, tried to rise. The black wolf planted one paw on her chest and pressed her into the snow with casual, absolute authority. It held her there for 3 heartbeats. Then it turned its head toward Sable. Those eyes. She knew those eyes, had seen them soften in firelight, had watched them close in the moments before sleep, had believed, once, that they would be the last thing she saw at the end of every day for the rest of her life. The black wolf released the rider and walked toward Sable with steps so careful they barely disturbed the trampled snow. It stopped before her, lowered its great head, and pressed its nose, gently, impossibly gently, against the curve of her belly. Both babies kicked at once. The wolf made a sound she had never heard from any creature, a low, broken keen that resonated below the threshold of hearing. Not a growl, not a whimper, a prayer. "Fenric," Sable whispered. The shift happened between one breath and the next. One moment the black wolf stood before her. The next, a man knelt in the snow, his hands hovering over her belly, his entire body shaking with a tremor he could not control. He looked up at her, and the Alpha King of Kelvarin was weeping. Sable had prepared for this moment without knowing she was preparing. During her exile, she had rehearsed 1,000 versions of what she would say if Fenric ever found her. Cold versions, furious versions. Versions where she dismantled him with surgical precision, using his own words as the blade. None of those versions had accounted for this. His cheeks were hollow. His dark hair hung lank and unwashed. His eyes, those tawny eyes that had once carried the easy authority of a born king, were sunken and rimmed with shadows so deep they looked like bruises. He had lost weight, lost color, lost some fundamental architecture of selfhood that she could not name. "You are alive," he breathed. "You are here. You are—" His gaze dropped to her belly. His hand reached toward it, shook, and stopped. "May I?" The question cracked something in Sable's chest that she had spent months sealing shut. She took his hand and placed it against the curve where his children grew. The children moved immediately, both of them. Dueling kicks from opposite sides that made Fenric's eyes widen and his breath catch, and his hand flatten against her dress as if trying to feel every possible inch of what he had missed. "Children," he whispered. "Our children. Sable, why did you not? Do not." The word came out like a blade leaving a sheath. Sable stepped back, pulling away from his touch. "Do not ask me why I kept this from the man who called me useful." Fenric flinched. "Called you— what?" "I heard you. I stood outside your study door and listened to you laugh with Valessa about how convenient I was. How my loyalty was guaranteed because I was too naive to see through your performance. How you planned to exile me to some village clinic like furniture being moved to storage." "Sable, I never said those words." "I heard your voice, Fenric. Your exact voice. Your exact laugh. Do not tell me I imagined it. I am telling you it was manufactured." Fenric rose to his feet, and even diminished, even ravaged by months of suffering, his presence filled the clearing like a change in atmospheric pressure. "Corin told you about the shadow speaker?" "Corin told me a story that conveniently absolves you of everything." "It is not a story." Fenric's voice cracked. "Do you think I would call you useful? You, Sable? The woman I marked because my wolf recognized you before I had the courage to say the words aloud? How convenient. A magical explanation that erases your betrayal entirely. Because I am dying, Sable." The clearing went silent. "The bond. When you left, it did not break. What we have is a true mate bond, the first in the Kelveran bloodline in 7 generations. And when you disappeared, the bond did not sever. It stretched. And it has been slowly killing me ever since." His hand went to his own chest, pressing against the place where his mark mirrored hers. "My wolf has been fighting me for control since the morning I found your chamber empty. Every day, the line between man and animal gets thinner. I have broken bones and walls and the jaw of my own cousin because the wolf does not understand why its mate is gone, and the grief has turned it savage." He stepped toward her. Sable did not step back. "I have not touched Valessa. When I discovered what the Grey Veins had done, I had their shadow speaker arrested. He confessed everything. The false conversation, the harvested voice fragments, the weeks of preparation. All of it designed to make you leave without a word, so that I would have no explanation, no trail, no way to find you." Sable's vision blurred. The walls she had built, the careful architecture of anger and self-preservation, were crumbling under the weight of his words and the anguish she could feel hammering through the bond. "I waited for you every morning," she whispered, "for 3 months before I left. You came to my chamber at dawn. You brought me tea and sat on the edge of my bed and told me about your dreams, and I kept waiting for the mask to slip, for you to say something that matched what I had heard, and you never did." Fenric made a sound that was not entirely human. "You were tender and kind and exactly the man I had fallen in love with, and it made the betrayal worse because I could not reconcile the 2 versions of you." "There were never 2 versions. There was only ever me." He reached for her face. His hands cupped her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted every sharp edge of his ruined appearance. I would have announced you at the Ascension. I had the declaration written, the crown commissioned. I was going to stand before every noble house in Kelverin and tell them that a healer born of the commons was the most extraordinary woman I had ever known, and that any wolf who could not accept her as queen did not deserve to call themselves part of my kingdom. A sob broke from Sable's throat. She pressed her forehead against his chest and felt his arms close around her with the grip of someone holding something he had been certain he would never touch again. "I hate you," she whispered into his shirt. "I know," he answered, his lips pressed to her hair. "I hate me too." "I do not actually hate you. I know that too." She hit his chest with her fist. There was no force behind it. Alone Fenric, pregnant, terrified, believing the person I loved most in the world had been performing for me. He caught her wrist and pressed her palm flat against his heartbeat. "Never again. I swear it on the bond, on the mark, on the lives growing inside you. Never again." They rode south through the night, Sable seated before Fenric on a black warhorse that moved with preternatural steadiness through the dark forest. His arm wrapped around her waist, his chest solid against her back, and the bond between them hummed with a resonance that was almost musical. The mark beneath her collarbone no longer burned. It pulsed with warmth, gentle, steady, like a heartbeat that had finally found its rhythm. "I need to tell you everything," Fenric murmured against her hair, "before we reach Kelverin." He told her about the morning he found her chamber empty, how he had stood in the doorway holding the cup of tea he brought her every dawn, staring at the stripped bed. How he had found the journal she left behind and opened it to the page where the wildflower lay, the bloom from the grove where he had given her the mark. How something inside him had snapped. "I shifted without deciding to. My wolf took over completely. It followed your scent north through the castle grounds, across the western river. Karan found me 3 days later, 70 miles from the capital, half wild, with your scent trail gone cold in a rainstorm." His arm tightened around her waist. "It took 6 wolves to bring me back to human form." "The kingdom suffered," Sable said quietly. It was not a question. A wolf separated from its true mate radiates instability through the pack bonds. The crops failed because the land responds to the alpha's state. I knew what was happening, and I could not stop it because every fiber of my being was consumed with finding you. Sable's hand found his where it rested on her belly. "I felt you, at night. A pressure, a searching." Fenric stiffened behind her. "You felt that?" "Every night. I told myself it was phantom pain. It was my wolf. When I slept, it reached for you. Every night without exception. I thought I was imagining a connection that no longer existed." "It existed," Sable said. "It always existed. I just could not let myself believe it." She turned in the saddle to look at him. In the silver moonlight, she could see the shadows under his eyes, the gauntness of his cheeks, the evidence of months of suffering etched into every line of his face. She reached up and touched his jaw, and he closed his eyes at the contact, as if her fingertips carried a current that completed something inside him. "We have both been through so much," she whispered. "Apart when we should have been together." Fenric's hand came up to cover hers. "Never again," he said. "Whatever comes next, we face it as one." They rode in silence for a while, the bond pulsing with shared warmth, and the twins, as if sensing their father's proximity, settled into a peace they had not known in weeks. "The gray veins," Sable said eventually. "What happened after you discovered what they had done?" "I arrested the shadow speaker," he confessed. But Valessa had already fled to her family's stronghold. Lord Aldrin denied all involvement and demanded a tribunal before the High Pack Council. And the council is compromised. 3 of the 7 seats are held by Greyvein allies. They blocked the tribunal. Declared the confession obtained under duress. accused me of fabricating charges to justify my obsession with a common-born woman. So the Greyveins are still in power. They are more than in power. While I searched for you, they consolidated. Alliances, military positions. Half the noble houses now believe I am unfit to rule. Dawn was breaking when they crested the final ridge and the capital spread before them. Kelverin's skyline should have been dominated by the iron spires of the royal keep. Instead, Sable saw smoke. Thick, dark columns rising from the merchant quarter and the eastern garrison. And above the main gate, where the royal standard should have flown, a different banner snapped in the wind. Silver serpent coiled around a dagger on a field of midnight blue. House Greyvein. No. The word left Fenric's chest like a physical blow. Not openly. They would not dare. A rider broke from the tree line, galloping hard. One of Fenric's scouts, his face ashen. My king, the Greyveins moved at midnight. Lord Aldrin has declared you unfit and named himself regent protector. Lady Valessa has claimed the throne as bonded queen. On what grounds? Fenric snarled. The Ascension Declaration, my lord. The one you wrote for the Lady Sable. The Greyveins found it in your study and altered it. It now bears Valessa's name. 3 council members have authenticated it as genuine. Sable felt Fenric's body go rigid behind her. His fury hit her through the bond like heat from an open furnace. There is more. They have taken hostages. 43 members of the household staff who refuse to kneel. They are to be executed at sundown as traitors. Who? Sable demanded. The scout looked at her with surprise, then recognition, then something like hope. The kitchen staff, the stable hands, and the old healer, my lady. Marin. The one who trained you when you first came to court. Marin. The woman who had taught Sable to grind poultices before she could read, who had pressed extra bread into her pockets when the kitchen matron was not looking, who had looked at the claiming mark beneath Sable's collarbone and said, with quiet certainty, "He has chosen well." We have to get them out, Sable said. Fenric looked down at her. Sable, you cannot go into that city. If the Greyveins capture you, if we do nothing, 43 people die because they were loyal to you. I will not let Marin die because she was kind to me. Something shifted in his expression. The anguish receded. What emerged beneath it was something older, harder. The face of a king who had finally found something worth fighting for beyond his own pain. My wolves, Fenric said, and his voice carried across the ridge like a war drum. Behind them, hundreds of shapes materialized from the forest. Wolves of every size and shade, their eyes gleaming, their bodies coiled. The Greyveins believe they have won. They are wrong. Today, we show them what happens to those who threaten our people, our true queen, and the heirs she carries. A howl rose from the assembled wolves, then hundreds more, a sound so unified it shook snow from the pines and sent birds erupting from the canopy. Together? Sable asked. Fenric pressed his lips to her temple. Always. The army surged down the ridge, and at its head, with his mate held close, the Alpha King rode to war. The outer walls fell within the hour. The Greyveins had fortified the gates and manned the battlements. They had not expected an army driven by months of accumulated fury and the primal imperative to protect the king's true mate and unborn heirs. Fenric fought like something out of legend. His black wolf form tore through barricades with a ferocity that made even his own warriors give him wide berth. By mid-morning, the castle gates lay in ruins. But as the sun climbed toward noon, a messenger came with news that turned the war personal. Lord Greyvein has sealed himself in the throne room with the hostages. He says if the king does not surrender, he will execute them all, beginning with the old healer. Sable was moving before the messenger finished speaking. Her back ached. Her belly strained against her dress. The children inside her kicked with agitated force. None of it mattered. She found Fenric at the throne room doors, held back by Corin and two other wolves. "You cannot go in," Corin was saying. "It is a trap. If I do nothing, they die." "Fenric." Sable pushed through the guards. He spun at her voice. "Sable, I told you to stay on the ridge. I know what you told me, and I am telling you that I will not hide while people die for the crime of being loyal to us." She placed her palm against his chest. "I love you. I loved you when I thought you had betrayed me. I loved you through exile and heartbreak. And I will not let that love make me a coward now." She turned toward the sealed doors. "Lord Greyvane," she called, "I am Sable, the woman your family has spent considerable resources trying to erase. I am coming in. Alone." Silence. Then a voice she did not recognize. Older. Cultured. "The healer girl. How unexpectedly bold. Enter." "Sable, no." Fenric caught her arm. She placed her free hand against his cheek. "Trust me. The way I should have trusted you that night. Please." Something passed between them. Not words. Faith. And beneath it, a prayer. Fenric released her arm. Sable pushed open the doors and stepped into the throne room. 43 hostages knelt in rows before the raised dais, their hands bound with iron, their faces white with exhaustion. Armed Greyvein soldiers stood behind them with blades drawn, each positioned at the back of a captive's neck. On the throne that belonged to Fenric sat Lord Aldrin Greyvein, his silver hair immaculate. Beside him, draped across the armrest, sat Valessa. Her frozen lake eyes found Sable immediately. "So this is what all the fuss has been about," Valessa said, a servant with a swollen belly and dirt on her feet. Sable ignored her. Her eyes found Marin in the second row. The old healer's face was bruised, her silver hair matted and tangled, but her eyes were fierce and clear. "Run, child," Marin whispered, "while you still can." "I am done running." Sable turned to face Lord Greyvein. "You want the king's surrender. I am offering you something more valuable." "And what might that be?" "Me." Sable placed both hands on her belly. "The king's true bonded mate and his unborn heirs. Take me as your hostage. Release the others." The roar from beyond the doors shook dust from the ceiling. Fenric's agony tore through the bond, and Sable felt every edge of it. But she held her ground. Greyvein studied her. Then he smiled. "How delightfully sacrificial. I accept." He waved a hand. "Release the prisoners. Secure the girl." "Father." Valessa straightened. "This is a mistake. She is more dangerous alive than dead. A living hostage who carries the royal bloodline is a leash around the king's throat. Guards, proceed." The hostages stumbled toward the doors in disbelief. Marin tried to reach Sable, but soldiers pushed her toward the exit. As rough hands closed around Sable's arms, she felt something unexpected. Calm. Not the numb calm of her flight from Kelveren. Something deeper. The stillness of having finally, completely, stopped running. The babies shifted inside her. Both of them, moving in unison at last, as if aligning themselves for something their mother could not yet see. And deep in Sable's chest, beneath the claiming mark, beneath the bond, something ancient began to stir. Luminous light began to bleed from beneath Sable's collarbone. It started as a faint glow, barely visible through her dress, and Greyvein dismissed it with a glance. A healer's parlor magic. Nothing that concerned a man who held a kingdom in his fist. He was wrong. The light intensified. It spread from the claiming mark across her chest, down her arms, through her fingers, until her hands were incandescent. The soldiers holding her arms released her with yelps, their palms burning where they had gripped her arms. "What is this?" Greyvein rose from the throne. Sable could not answer. The twins were not kicking but radiating. She could feel their energy pouring into her bloodstream like twin rivers feeding a rising sea, and with it came a force that made her healing gift look like a candle held against the sun. Pain hit her like a thunderclap. Her knees buckled and she caught herself on the edge of the dais as every bone in her body began to vibrate. "No," she gasped. "Not now." But her body was no longer asking permission. Months of suppressed change, held back by fear and denial, would not be contained. The children she carried were the product of a true mate bond, and their combined magic had unlocked a door in their mother's blood that had been sealed since birth. She was shifting, for the first time in her life, without warning, in the center of an enemy stronghold. The throne room doors exploded inward. Fenric burst through in full wolf form, a black hurricane of fur and wrath, his eyes finding Sable immediately. Gray-veined soldiers surged to intercept him. Valessa screamed commands, chaos erupted, and Sable's transformation consumed her. Every bone broke and reformed. Her skin rippled as fur pushed through. Her senses expanded so violently she could hear individual heartbeats across the room, could smell the steel of drawn weapons and the cortisol in every soldier's sweat. Greyvein had drawn a sword from beneath his cloak. The blade shimmered with an oily, iridescent sheen, venom-bane steel, lethal to any wolf it cut. "If I cannot rule through your mate," Greyvein snarled, advancing on her trembling form, "then I will rule alone after he watches you fall." The sword descended. Light erupted from Sable's chest like a detonation, a wall of radiant force that caught the venombane blade and stopped it dead, 6 inches from her throat. The steel glowed white-hot in Greyvein's grip, and he screamed as the handle seared into his palm, the sword clattering to the floor with a sound like a bell struck once and silenced. The transformation completed in a surge of blinding fire. Where a woman had knelt, a wolf now stood. Her fur was the white of birch bark in winter. Her eyes blazed with gold threaded through with filaments of light. She was smaller than Fenric's black form, but the power that radiated from her body was not smaller. It was different. Where his was force and wrath, hers was resonance. It vibrated through the room like the lowest note of a cathedral organ, hitting frequencies that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the animal inside every wolf in the chamber. The gray-veined soldiers dropped their weapons, not because they chose to, because their wolves, deep inside their human shells, had heard that resonance and recognized it for what it was, the voice of a true queen. Sable lunged. Her jaws closed around Greyvein's wrist with surgical precision, the same precision she had used to set bones and close wounds for years, and she felt the joint dislocate before her teeth finished closing. The Lord screamed. The venombane blade lay forgotten on the floor. Fenric reached her side. His black fur pressed against her white, and the bond between them burned with a connection so intense it was nearly blinding. "You shifted." His voice resonated inside her skull. "Sable, you shifted." "I had motivation," she replied, and the ease of the mental connection startled her, as if she had been speaking this language her entire life. Valessa had retrieved her father's fallen sword. She stood at the top of the dais, the venombane blade quaking in her grip, her composure gone entirely. "You were supposed to be nothing," Valessa hissed, "a convenient body, a useful set of hands." Sable let the wolf dissolve, her body flowing back into its human shape. The transition was fluid, almost graceful, as if her body had been waiting its entire life to learn this language of transformation. She stood before her enemy, one hand resting on her belly where the babies still grew, sheltered through the shift by the light that had accompanied every moment of the change. "I did not destroy anything," Sable said quietly. "Your family built on a foundation of lies and manufactured cruelty. It was always going to collapse. I was simply the weight that brought it down." Valessa charged. Fenric's jaws caught her wrist before the blade traveled a foot. He shifted back, holding the struggling woman immobile while his wolves flooded the throne room. "Valessa of House Greyvein," Fenric announced, You and your family are charged with treason, conspiracy against the crown, employment of illegal sorcery, and the attempted murder of the true Queen of Kelvarin. You cannot do this. The declaration bears my name. A forged declaration built on a stolen document. His eyes were molten gold. You took the words I wrote for Sable and put your name where hers belonged, as if replacing a name on paper could replace a bond written in blood and bone and soul. Guards took Valessa. Coran, battered but standing, directed the wolves to secure Lord Greyvein. Fenric turned to Sable. His hands found her face, and this time there was no hesitation. He held her, as if she were the answer to a question he had been asking for months. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Sable took inventory. Her body hummed with unfamiliar energy. The constant ache beneath her mark was gone, replaced by resonant warmth that matched his heartbeat. "Better than well," she said. "I think the shift healed something that was broken long before the Greyveins broke it." Fenric pulled her close and held her, and she felt the last of his walls come down. They completed the bond that evening in the chamber above the throne room, with the sounds of a liberated castle drifting through the window. Sable pressed her mouth to the place where Fenric's neck met his shoulder, and let her claiming bite seal against his shoulder. The bond detonated between them. Not pain. Completion. Two halves of a circuit finally closing, and the current that rushed through them carried everything. Every memory, every hidden corner of two hearts laid bare. She saw the morning he found her chamber empty, the cup of tea growing cold, the wildflower falling to the floor, the moment his wolf took over, the blind run northward. The nights Corin and 5 other wolves pinned him against frozen ground, while he howled her name until his throat bled. And he saw himself through her eyes, not a deceiver. The man who brought her tea at dawn and traced her mark with reverent fingertips. The one whose absence had left a wound no healing magic could close. When she released him, they were both shaking. "My queen," he breathed. "My king," she answered. In the weeks that followed, the Greyveins faced judgment. Lord Aldrin was condemned to death for treason. Valessa was stripped of her name, her wolf sealed dormant by the same sorcery her family had once wielded as a weapon, and she was confined to a windowless tower in the eastern marches, condemned to spend her remaining years listening to the howls of wolves she could never again become. The shadow speaker, whose testimony had unraveled every thread of the conspiracy, was exiled with his voice magically sealed, never to harvest another person's words. The kingdom healed. The crops pushed green shoots through thawed earth. The wolves who had gone wild returned to their senses as the completed bond radiated stability through every pack in the realm. And on a warm evening in late spring, as light poured through the windows of the royal chamber, Sable gave birth to twins. A boy with his father's dark hair and hands that already glowed faintly when he gripped his mother's finger. A girl with fur the color of birch bark when she shifted, minutes after birth, and eyes that burned with gold. Fenric held his children with tears on his face and wonder in his hands. "Thank you," he whispered to the woman who lay exhausted and radiant, and finally, completely, home. "For fighting for us when I could not fight for myself." Sable reached up and traced the claiming mark on his throat. The mark that matched the one beneath her collarbone, both healed into silver scars that sang to each other with every heartbeat. "I never stopped fighting," she said softly. "Even when I thought I was running, I was fighting my way back to you. I just did not know it yet." Fenric leaned down and kissed her, and the bond between them hummed with the low, warm frequency of something permanent, something that had survived poison and politics and exile, and the worst kind of cruelty that one heart could inflict upon another, and had emerged not merely intact, but stronger, tempered, unbreakable. Their children stirred between them, 2 small bodies carrying the combined legacy of a healer's compassion and a king's strength, and the bond that held their family together beat in perfect, endless rhythm. Outside the window, the wolves of Kelvarin lifted their voices in a chorus of joy that carried across the kingdom, over mountains and forests, and the eastern tower where a nameless woman listened to the sound and understood at last what she had lost. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.